এটি মডার্ন HTML এবং CSS এর উপরে 17 ঘন্টা ব্যাপী পূর্ণাঙ্গ ইন্টারন্যাশনাল কোর্স। আপনারা যারা লোকাল বাংলা কোর্স করেছেন বা ইউটিউব থেকে ফ্রি কোর্স করেছেন বাট এখনও অ্যাডভান্স লেভেলে ওয়েব ডেভেলপমেন্টের বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস শিখতে পারেন নাই, তাদের জন্য এই কোর্স। এই কোর্সটি কম্পোজ করেছেন হাইলি রেটেড প্রোগ্রামার ব্রেট ট্রেভার্সি, যার কোর্স কমপ্লিট করেছে 2 লাখেরও বেশি স্টুডেন্ট। লাইক আই সেড, এই কোর্স থেকে আপনি ওয়েব ডেভেলপমেন্টের বেস্ট প্র্যাকটিস শিখতে পারবেন। ফর এক্সাম্পল, প্রথম দিকে আমরা ওয়েবসাইট লেআউটে টেবিল ট্যাগ ইউজ করতাম, এরপরে আসলো ফ্লোট বেসড রেসপন্সিভ লেআউট, বাট নাও ইটস অল অ্যাবাউট ফ্লেক্সবক্স। তেমনি অ্যানিমেশনে আমরা জাভা স্ক্রিপ্ট ইউজ করতাম, বাট এখন স্মুথ অ্যানিমেশনের জন্য CSS3 ইউজ করা হয়। আপনি এখানে অনেকগুলো লাইভ প্রজেক্ট করতে পারবেন। সবগুলো প্রজেক্টের কোর্স ম্যাটেরিয়াল আমার ওয়েবসাইটে পাবেন, ডিসক্রিপশনে লিঙ্ক দেওয়া আছে। কমপ্লিট কোর্স ফি মাত্র 700 টাকা, তবে 200 টাকা ডিসকাউন্ট পেতে পারেন, প্রসেসটা ডিসক্রিপশনে দেওয়া আছে। সো স্যাম্পল কোর্সটা শুরু করুন, দেন ইউ ক্যান ডিসাইড হোয়েদার ইউ শুড বাই দ্য ফুল কোর্সেস।
Hello and welcome to Modern HTML and CSS from the beginning. In this video, I just want to talk a little bit about what you can expect from this course. So this is going to be a comprehensive course on HTML and CSS, and we're going to start from the absolute beginning, starting with HTML5 markup. We'll go through all the basics of CSS to the latest features like Flexbox, CSS grid, animation, variables, responsive design, and much more. Not only that, you'll also learn Sass in this course, which is a CSS precompiler that extends the syntax of CSS to include things like nesting, inheritance, functions, and more. This course is composed of both learning sections where we'll basically be working in a sandbox to look at certain features, and then we have about a half dozen projects ranging in size, and then some mini projects on top of that. So who is this course actually for? The short answer is everyone. Whether you're an absolute beginner looking to learn how to build websites, how websites work, or a seasoned developer that wants to get better at CSS, Sass, and UI creation in general without having to rely on frameworks like Bootstrap. So sections 1 through 4 are geared more towards beginners as we go over the basics of HTML and CSS. So if you're comfortable with things like HTML5 and CSS topics like font styles, basic alignment, margin and padding, things like that, then feel free to skip these sections and start using Flex, CSS grid, animation, and Sass. So here's a summary of some of the things that we'll be going over in this course. So we'll start with the basics of how websites work and how the internet works in general in terms of IP addresses, how exactly a website that's stored on a server somewhere else gets displayed in your browser. We'll look at setup and tools. We're using a text editor called VS Code, which is definitely the most popular editor in the web development world, and we'll be using tools such as Emmet. We'll install a couple different extensions as well, get a workflow going. We'll look at HTML5 in terms of just the core basics of tags and attributes. We'll look at all the basic tags. We'll also look at the semantic tags like header, footer, aside, things like that, and show you how to structure a proper HTML5 document. We'll be looking at CSS fundamentals like the box model, font styles, things like that. Responsive design, so media queries, making everything look good on mobile devices, including smartphones and tablets. Every single project we create is going to be responsive. Okay, we'll be looking at Flexbox, CSS grid, which are ways to align columns and rows. We'll be looking at animation with transitions and keyframes, CSS variables, transforms, pseudo-selectors. We'll be building things like sticky menus, overlays. We'll be styling forms and landing pages. We'll even look at website deployment, so making your website live on the internet using a shared host. We'll also be looking at a platform called And then finally, we'll look at Sass, which is a CSS precompiler to allow us to basically extend the functionality of CSS. And we'll create a portfolio project with that. All right, so as I said, this is going to be a mix of learning sections and projects. The learning lectures will include specific topics such as the box model, media queries, and many other things. And then we'll also have 6 good-sized projects along with some other mini projects. So the first website project we'll be building is this hotel website, which is before we even get into Flexbox and the grid and anything like that. We'll be using just basic CSS here, including floats, because I think it's important to learn the basics, even though for the most part you're going to be using Flex or the grid. Next project is this Edge Ledger website, which is a single page site for a financial company. It includes Flexbox, image overlay, sticky menu, things like that. We will be implementing a little bit of JavaScript for smooth scroll. We'll be doing this in a couple projects. However, JavaScript is not the focus of this course. I just want to make that clear. We will be using a little bit of it, but we're not going to really get into JavaScript. This course is more about UI and HTML, CSS, and Sass. So the next project is a news grid site where we use CSS grid. We use grid template columns, and I show you how to span rows and things like that. Next, we'll build a landing page that uses a hamburger menu. So you guys have probably seen this before. You click it and it opens up a menu. We'll have a big overlay that has the menu items. We'll also animate the hamburger menu itself. Then we have a CSS timeline project where we have different items on the timeline. We're going to add a little bit of JavaScript here to bring the items in from the side as we scroll down. And then the last project is a Sass project where we create a 4-page portfolio site with a home, about, a work page with some pretty in-depth CSS animations, transitions, and then a contact page. And we're going to deploy this to a platform called Netlify and make the contact page actually work with spam filtering. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you enjoy the course and learn a lot from it. So let's jump in and get started. All right, so before we get started, I feel like it's important that you know at least the basic idea of how the process of getting and loading a web page in your browser works. So for some of you, this may be very simple. You may already know this stuff. For some of you, this may be very confusing and daunting. If it is confusing, just know that you'll understand this process more as time goes on, and you don't need to know it to start building websites. I think a good metaphor for this is that you don't need to know how an engine works to be able to learn how to drive a car. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about here in this section, it all happens under the hood. So if you're a beginner and you're just stepping into this world, don't worry if you don't understand this stuff. I just think it's important to mention before we start. All right, so we all use the internet every day, but most people don't know how it actually works. And they just know they go to, Facebook.com or whatever, and it loads their profile, their social media. So I'm going to try to explain what actually goes on under the hood in very simple terms. Basically, the internet is a global network of computers and devices, and these computers have what's called an IP address to uniquely identify them, just like an actual address for your home. And these IP addresses, they're assigned to you by your internet service providers. And they're usually in the form of 4 numbers with dots in between, just like this here. Now, this is a version 4 IP address. There's also version 6 IP addresses that are much longer. And these were created for when we run out of version 4 IP addresses. And you can actually go to Google and just search "what's my IP," and you'll find different sites that will actually trace it and show it to you if you want to know what your current IP address is. Now, even if you have multiple devices in your home, like let's say you have 2 computers, a tablet, a mobile device, each of these devices, they all have what's called a private IP address that is only local to your network, your home network. Your router, however, has a public IP address, and that's the IP address that the internet actually sees. All the private ones for each device, that's only within your home network or your office network, whatever it may be. All right, now the way that computers talk to each other is over something called the TCP/IP protocol. And a protocol is basically just a way for computers to communicate, almost like a language, so they can speak to each other. Don't worry too much about this. If you're getting into computer networking and stuff like that, it's very important to understand the different network layers and so on, how data packets are sent. But that's not important for what we're doing here or even to become a web developer. Now, HTTP is a little more important for you to understand. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if you notice, when you type in a website URL like google.com, Facebook, you're usually doing HTTP or HTTPS. HTTPS is for secure connections using an SSL certificate, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, HTTP is what's called an application layer protocol, and it actually runs over TCP, and it's responsible for handling web traffic between a browser like Google Chrome or Firefox and a web server that stores a website, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. So HTTP is one of many types of application layer protocols. You also have, for instance, SMTP, which deals with email. You have FTP and SSH. These deal with transferring files over the internet. HTTP, however, is going to be the one you deal with the most in web development. So websites and web pages are basically just files that are stored on computers that run a piece of software called a web server. And an example of a web server would be Apache or Nginx. Don't worry if you've never heard of these before. Technically, you could run a web server from your home on a computer, but most ISPs prohibit doing that, and you probably wouldn't want to do that anyways, because if for some reason the computer shuts off or something happens, your website goes down. So what you usually do is you can build a website on your local machine at your home or office, and then you would upload it to a hosting company, okay, or to a server that a hosting company owns. And there's all different types of hosting accounts. You can actually get a dedicated server, which is an actual computer that's dedicated to you for your use, but those are really expensive. You have shared hosting where you share accounts on one server with other people. This is much cheaper, and I'll go over the different types of hosting in a later section. But that's basically what you're going to do, is use a hosting company. And in addition to that, you're going to need a domain name, which can be a .com, .net, .org, and many other TLDs. Now, remember, all computers, including web servers, have an IP address, but it would really suck if you wanted to go to Facebook or Google and you had to remember something like 7522.128.131. So what happens is when you type in, for instance, http://www.facebook.com, there's something called a DNS, or a domain name service, that actually maps that domain to the correct IP address of facebook.com or whatever website you're visiting. And this makes our lives much easier. Otherwise, you'd probably have a notebook with, hundreds of numbers for each website that you want to visit. So later on, I'm actually going to show you how to register a domain name and how to upload a website to a web hosting account. All right, so let's take a quick look at a diagram that kind of explains what we've been talking about. So you, the user, down at the bottom, types in, let's say, google.com into a web browser, and this could be Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, any web browser, and the DNS server looks at the domain name, such as google.com, and it maps it to the IP address that's needed, as you can see right here. Okay, once it gets that IP address, it then makes what's called an HTTP request to the web server of that IP address. And then that web server will return a response with the HTML file that needs to be loaded, any other files, including CSS files, which are used for styling. You have any images that are on the page, those will get sent, and whatever else is needed for google.com to be loaded in your browser. Now, these HTTP requests, they're made when you load a web page as well as when you, for instance, submit a form. Okay, and there's different types of requests, there's different status codes, but that's all stuff you're going to learn later on when you get into scripting and programming. You don't need to know that stuff to create basic static web pages with HTML and CSS. Okay, so this is obviously a very brief summary. There's a lot more that goes into it. It's much more intricate when you get into networking layers and so on. But that, again, that's not stuff that you guys need to know right now. One thing about web development in general is it can be very overwhelming because there's just so many different technologies to learn. But HTML and CSS, they're the building blocks of all websites and web applications. So in the next video, I want to talk more about the roles of HTML and CSS. All right, guys, so web development involves many different technologies, including HTML, CSS, programming languages, frameworks, tools, and much more. But HTML and CSS are what I call the building blocks. This is where you're going to start, whether you want to build just simple 5-page websites or large social networks and online stores. So I want to talk about the different roles of HTML and CSS, how they play into web development. So HTML is actually short for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's exactly what it is. It's a markup language. Many people that are brand new to web development think it's actually a programming language, but it's not. A programming language is where you write code that can do things based on logic. So you can check to see if something is true or false, and then do some type of action based on that condition. You can also do things like math. You can create reusable functions, and the list goes on. You can't do any of that with HTML. HTML is purely visual, and it's used to create and construct documents that are viewable inside of a web browser. It doesn't have any kind of behavior associated with it other than displaying content. And when I say content, I mean text, links, images, things like that. Now, this isn't to minimize HTML. In fact, there is no internet as far as the web browser goes without HTML. It's extremely important and relevant, and it always will be. Every single site that you visit displays its markup using HTML, and sometimes it's handwritten, sometimes it's actually generated by another programming language, but when you view the compiled source of a website, you're always going to see HTML markup. Okay, now HTML by itself is used to display content, but it has little to no styling. So HTML on its own is very, very ugly. And this is where CSS comes in. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's what's called a styling language or a style sheet language. Like HTML, it's not an actual programming language. It's purely visual, only instead of being used to display content, it's used to style the content and style the layout. Now, CSS is getting more powerful itself. You can now have things like variables. You can do some calculations and so on. It can also be extended with something called Sass or Less, which are CSS precompilers. We'll talk a little bit more about Sass later and talk about some of the things you can do with it, but we're gonna do that much later. So basically these two go hand in hand. HTML handles the content display, CSS handles styling it with colors, alignment, fonts, and everything else to do with the styling. Now, as I said, web development includes a huge range of technologies to the point where sometimes it's very overwhelming. But these two are the building blocks because no matter how complicated the web application, it still uses HTML and CSS to display the visual appearance. Let's take a web app like Facebook or Amazon. These are huge web applications that do things like have user accounts. You can sign up, register. You can create posts on Facebook. Amazon does credit card processing. She has a shopping cart. You can't have that functionality with just HTML and CSS. You need some kind of back-end programming language, and there's a lot to choose from. And you also need a database for storage of user accounts and posts and stuff like that. Now, this is stuff you're going to learn in another course, but without HTML and CSS, Facebook and Amazon cease to exist because HTML and CSS are responsible for displaying the content to you in a browser, whether it's on a computer, mobile device, or tablet, whatever it may be. So these two technologies are always the first ones that you're going to learn before moving to more advanced web programming to build shopping carts and stuff like that. So you can kind of think of HTML and CSS as the human body, and think of programming with other languages as the human brain. They both need each other. Now, JavaScript is sort of in its own league because it is a programming language, but it can run on both the front end, which is within the browser, as well as on the back end server. Okay, so JavaScript can be used in the front end for things like form validation, click events, stuff like that. So JavaScript is probably the next thing you want to learn after HTML and CSS. All right, so we've established basically the purpose of HTML and CSS. It's to display web pages and style web pages. So what can we do with just HTML and CSS, not knowing any other programming language? So after this course, you'll be able to build any kind of static website. And by static, I mean still. So something where you're not creating user accounts, you're not creating posts, things like that. And a good example of a static website is, let's say, a portfolio to display some of your projects, a small business website, maybe a plumber wants a website where they can display their company info, their contact info, stuff like that. Plumber, construction, flower shop, anything like that. Also informational and brochure websites. Okay, you can build some really, really beautiful stuff with just HTML and CSS. You just can't have that special kind of functionality like a shopping cart or something like that. You're going to need to learn more to do that stuff. You can also build the visual part of anything. So even an online store or a huge social network like Facebook, you could build basically the shell of it. You'll just have to have a programmer add the life to it where you can actually click post and have it post, or upload an image or something like that. Okay, so you can do this stuff with just HTML and CSS, and I'm going to show you all of this throughout the course. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to set up our environment. We're going to need something called a text editor so that we can actually write our HTML and CSS. We're gonna use something called VS Code, and we're going to install some extensions to allow it to do some extra things for us. And of course, you need a web browser. We're going to talk about all this in the next video. All right, guys, so we're almost ready to start learning how to learn HTML, CSS, build websites. But before we do that, we need a couple things. What's good about learning HTML and CSS is it doesn't take much to get started. If you're learning a more complex language like, let's say, PHP or Python or something like that, usually you'll need to install a web server locally so that you can develop on your local machine, and that takes a lot more work. Some languages even need to be compiled, and you need something called an IDE. But with HTML, CSS, we can simply click on an HTML file and run it in a browser. We can also edit it with a text editor. So those are the two things we need, is a browser and a text editor. Now, it doesn't matter what operating system you're on. If you're using Windows, Mac, Linux, you can see I'm on a Mac, but everything we do in this course, it doesn't matter what you're on. And if there is something little that's specific to Windows, I will mention it for you guys that are using Windows. Now, your system comes with a browser and a text editor. So for Windows, you have, for instance, Edge and Notepad. For Mac, you have Safari and TextEdit, but these are not good for web development, especially the text editors. For a browser, I would definitely recommend Google Chrome. It's the most popular in the web development community. It's very fast. It's fast to adapt new features in CSS, JavaScript, and so on. It also has really great development tools. Second to Chrome, I would say Firefox. As far as a text editor, you don't want to use Notepad or anything like that because there's no features, there's no syntax highlighting, anything like that. There's a lot of choices, but what I would recommend and what I'm going to use is Visual Studio Code. And I use this for everything. I don't just use it for HTML, CSS. I also use it for PHP, JavaScript, Python, any language that I work with, because it's just very fast, it's intuitive, has a lot of features, it has great extensions, and it's just all around, it's just a great editor. So that's what we'll be using. I don't have it installed, so I'm going to go ahead and download it, and it's available for Windows, Mac, or Linux. Doesn't matter what system you're on. So on a Mac, it's just going to give me the zip file. I'll go ahead and open it up or unpackage it, and you can see I have my icon here, and I'm just going to bring it to my applications folder. Okay, so once it's in there, I can open it up. I'm actually going to drag it down to my bar, which you guys can't see, just so I can easily access it. And then I'll go ahead and open it. So when you first open up VS Code, you'll see a welcome page. It'll give you some options like open up a file, open a folder. It'll show your recent projects, and the only reason I have recent projects is because I already had VS Code installed. I just uninstalled it for this course. If also over here, if you want to change your theme, so if I click color theme, it'll open up this, which is the command palette. And for instance, we could change it to a light theme, and you can kind of experiment with these a little bit. I'm just going to keep the regular dark theme like that. So let's close this welcome page up and head over to the sidebar. So this first icon here is your file explorer. So when you have a website or a web application, it's going to be in a folder, and you're going to want to open that folder so that you can see the files and access them easily. So I actually have a folder that is on my desktop that I'm going to open, called Split Landing Page, which is just a very simple website with some JavaScript and HTML, CSS. So I'm going to open that, and you'll see that I have the files over here. So we have one HTML file, we have a CSS file for styling, and then we have a JavaScript file. And when I just click them once, notice that they just open and they just stay in this one tab, and then it kind of closes when I click on the next one. If I double click, it'll stay. So if I go click on the next file, notice that the HTML, index HTML stayed there. Okay, if I double click this one, it'll stay there, and then I can just close them up. Okay, and we'll be working in the File Explorer quite a bit. So the next thing I want to show you is the settings. Now this text right here is way too small, especially for doing a course. You guys probably can barely read this. So to get to the settings, you can go to this little gear, and you can go to settings, or you can do Control, comma on a Windows machine, or Command, comma on a Mac, and that'll also bring you to the settings. As we go along here, I'm going to be teaching you guys some of the keyboard shortcuts, because your workflow really speeds up when you learn shortcuts. And when we write our code, our HTML, CSS, I'm going to teach you some shortcuts to navigate around really easily as well. So what I want to change is the font size, which is actually right here, editor font size. But if I couldn't find this, I could just search for it up here. So I could say font size, and you can see now it's at the top here. It's 14 pixels by default, so I want to change it to 26, and that should take effect right away. The only other setting I want to change is my tab space. So if I type in tab spaces, the default is 4, and what this means is the number of spaces that it indents when you hit tab. Okay, because in HTML and in most languages, you're gonna indent to organize your code, but 4 is a little too much for me. I like to keep it at 2, so I'm going to change that to 2, and that should save right away. So let's close up the settings, and now if I go back to, let's say, index HTML, notice the font is much bigger. Okay, and a tab now is 2 spaces as opposed to 4. So the last thing I want to do is just go over these other icons. This one is just to search. So if you want to search within the page, you can also replace. This is for version control with Git. We're not going to get into that right now. This is a debugger for programming languages like Python, JavaScript, and so on. Also something we're not going to get into. But this one right here, the last one, is your extensions. Okay, so you can extend the functionality of VS Code with a whole bunch of extensions, and we don't have any installed right now, but it does show some of the popular ones, shows us some of the recommendations. If you want to search, you can search, like let's say we're using PHP. If we want to search for PHP extensions, like this one right here, IntelliSense, and if we click on that, it'll show us a bunch of documentation and examples. Basically, this gives you some PHP drop downs, as you can see right here. If we wanted to install this, we could just click the green install button, and it would simply get installed. And if I make this a little bigger, you can see the number of downloads. You can see this one has 5.7 million downloads and a rating of 3.5. Okay, so you see the number of downloads as well as the ratings. And I do have a couple extensions that I want to install later, but I don't want to get into that right now. All right, so now that you have VS Code set up, in the next section, we're going to jump in and we're going to start to learn HTML. All right, welcome to HTML Basics. So in this section, we're going to start learning HTML5 from absolute scratch. And I just want to stress that this section is geared towards absolute beginners. I know that there's a few different types of people taking this course. Those of you that are just getting into this, that need to learn HTML, this is geared towards you guys. And then there's those of you that are comfortable with HTML that took this course to learn more about creating better looking websites and user interfaces, see it more geared towards CSS. Just be aware that this particular section is very basic and it might be a lot of stuff that you already know. So feel free to skip it if you need to. So here's what we'll be covering in this section. We'll talk a little bit about what HTML is. We'll look at the syntax of HTML tags and attributes, how to structure a page, including the doc type, meta tags. We're going to set up VS Code with an extension called Live Server so that we can open our HTML pages easily in a little local development server. We're going to talk about keyboard shortcuts in VS Code, also Emmet. Forms and input, links and images, tables and lists. We're going to look at the differences between block level elements and inline elements. We'll look at divs, spans, compare IDs and classes, HTML entities, and we'll also look at the HTML5 semantic tags. So the way this is going to work is for every section we'll be creating a new file in a folder called HTML Sandbox, and I want you guys to have this as a reference to go back to if needed. And we're going to target specific tags and concepts in each file. Okay, so we'll have like a forms and input file. We'll have a file for tables and lists and paragraphs and headings, things like that. So we're going to do it in this section and in the next CSS section, and then after that we'll build a real website using all the knowledge that we learned from both. All right, so I'm going to include both the starting files and the finished sandbox in this lecture for you to download. So you can either use that or you can create the files as we move along like I'm doing. And then I also want to mention that HTML itself without CSS is very, very ugly. So everything in this section is going to look like crap in the browser because there's no styling. When we get to the CSS section, we'll start learning how to align things, how to add backgrounds, colors, borders, stuff like that. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. All right, guys, so we're going to jump right in and start to learn HTML. We're going to learn all the important HTML5 tags, attributes. We'll learn how to insert images into pages, links, forms, stuff like that. And I realize that a lot of you guys probably already know some of this stuff, so feel free to skip around, skip some videos. If you want to skip this whole section altogether, that's fine. Later on, after section 3, we'll be getting into like CSS Grid and Flexbox and animations and more difficult stuff. But again, I want this course to be very friendly for absolute beginners that have never even touched HTML before. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new folder for our HTML files. So we'll just go ahead and right click and say new folder, and I'm going to rename this to HTML Sandbox. And the idea here is for every section, or every video I should say, we're going to be touching on a different topic. So for instance, we'll look at like links and images in a video, we'll look at forms and input, and I want to have a separate file for each video and create a sandbox that you can use as a reference if you need to go back to it later on to see how a tag is structured or what attributes it takes, things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this up in VS Code, in Visual Studio Code. And there's a few ways to do that. If you're on Windows, you should be able to right-click and say Open with Code. You can do it that way. If you're on a Mac, you can drag it down to your VS Code icon in your bar down below, or you can just open up VS Code and just click Open Folder and then search for it. So mine's on my desktop. There it is, HTML Sandbox, and I'll go ahead and open. All right, so we can close this up, and now on the side you can see the HTML Sandbox folder is open. So let's go ahead and create our first HTML file. And I'm basically going to create a file called index.html. Whoops, not comma, but .html. Now there's something really important for Windows users. If you are seeing a .txt here after the .html, then you have to actually change something in your folder settings. All right, so I have a screenshot here. If you're on Windows and you're seeing a .txt, you should check this anyways to make sure that this box is unchecked. What you want to do is go to your View tab in your file manager and go to Options right here, and then click Change Folder and Search Options. You'll get a box like this that pops up, and you want to click the View tab and make sure that this is unchecked, this Hide Extensions for Known File Types. Okay, you want it to show the file extension. So just make sure that that's unchecked if you're on Windows. All right, so I just wanted to mention that so you don't run into problems. So now we have an HTML file. So what do we do with this? We need to put in what's called an HTML tag. Okay, so HTML files are full of HTML tags which surround content. So let's take a look at how HTML tags are actually formatted. So elements are surrounded in angle brackets. So basically the less than and greater than signs. So the element here, for example, is an H1, and different elements do different things. This is a heading tag. There's actually H1 through H6, and I'm going to go over that in another video. But basically this will make this text much bigger. Okay, this here is a paragraph tag, which is just for paragraphs, just regular sized text. And notice that there's an opening tag and there's a closing tag, or a start and an end tag. And the end tag has a /. Okay, so that's how you identify the ending tag. Now, there are some self-closing tags for stuff that doesn't have content inside of it, like the H1 and the paragraph, they have content inside. The BR tag is actually just a line break, so it just kind of skips a line. So there's no need to put any content inside of it, so it's a self-closing tag. It doesn't need an ending tag. Now, notice that this one has a / and this one doesn't. This is actually a remnant of XHTML, which is a derivative of HTML, and it's not used that much anymore. HTML5 is definitely the standard. That's what you want to learn. In HTML5, you could use either of these. So you can use the XHTML version with the line or the /, but you don't need to. This would be just fine. Okay, so this is how tags are structured. So what I'm going to do now is just put in a couple tags, and I want to show you how to open an HTML file in the browser. So remember, tags have an opening angle bracket, and we'll do an H1, which is a heading. We'll close that H1. And with VS Code, every text editor is different. With VS Code, it's going to end the tag for you. Okay, so notice that the ending tag was put in automatically, which is very helpful. And VS Code actually has a tool that comes pre-installed called Emmet, which you can use to type really fast HTML. And I'm going to show you some tips and tricks with Emmet as we move along. So let's put something in here. We'll just say, welcome to my website. And then we're going to go on the next line, and we're going to put a paragraph tag. Now remember, we have Emmet installed, and with Emmet we can just do P, because we want a paragraph tag, which is a P, and then we can hit enter or tab. Okay, you can do enter or tab, and it'll actually complete it for us. Okay, so it makes it very easy. If we want, an H2 tag, we can do H2 enter. If we want, let's say, an image tag, we can do IMG enter, and that will actually give us the attributes that we need. I'm going to go over all this stuff later, so don't worry about it. But just to show you that Emmet is very helpful, and it allows you to write HTML very fast. Okay, so in the paragraph, let's just say this is my very first website. Okay, so we just have a heading tag and a paragraph. Let's go ahead and save this. You can either go to File, Save, or you can just do Control-S or Command-S on a Mac, and that will save the file. Okay, so now let's go ahead and minimize this, and let's go into our HTML sandbox folder, and you can see we have our index.html file. Now, you might have a different icon. It's probably going to be whatever your default browser is. It could be Chrome or Safari or Edge if you're on Windows. So you just want to open this with a browser. So I'm actually going to right-click and just say Open with Google Chrome, which is my default browser. And there it is. So you can see that the H1 is a large heading, and then the paragraph is just normal sized text. But this is in fact an HTML file. You can see in the URL bar here, it gives us the full path. Okay, yours will probably be different, but mine is in my desktop in HTML sandbox and then index.html. Now, of course, when you upload this to a web host, it'll be your domain name. So let's say you registered mywebsite.com, which of course is already taken, but we'll use that as an example. So this would be replaced. This file, this stuff here would all be replaced with whatever your domain is. Now, there's a reason that I called it index.html, and this name here is significant because when you call it index.html, this is your home page. If we were to upload this to a host with, let's say, mywebsite.com as the domain, if we go to mywebsite.com, it's going to load the index page. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. Whatever you want your home page, you want to call that index. And then any other page you can call whatever you want. Like let's say you had an about page that listed your company info or something like that. You could create an about.html page, upload it, and then you would go to mywebsite.com/about.html. Okay, and that would load that. But index is significant because that's always going to be your home page. All right, so now that we have created an HTML file and opened it with Chrome, in the next video I'm going to show you how to correctly structure an document, because this isn't correct. There's some other things that we need to add in order for it to be a valid HTML document. All right, so we'll get into that next. All right, guys, so in the last video, we created an index HTML file. We opened it inside of a browser so we could see how it renders. And this is not the standard of how to create a document. There's some other things that you need to add. Even if we only wanted to display this in the browser, there's some other tags that we need to add for it to be a valid HTML5 document. Now, before we do anything, I'm going to rename this file. So instead of index, I'm going to rename it to 01_basic_layout.html, because like I said, I want this to be a sandbox that you can go back to and you can check certain things, and I want each file to be named after what we're doing inside of it. Okay, so we're going to just number them so they're in order. If you don't want to number them, you don't have to. You could call it just basic layout or basic or whatever, but I want to be very specific, and I want you guys to have this for future reference. All right, so basic layout of an HTML page. Let's actually just get rid of this for now. So the first thing that you're going to want on every HTML page is the doc type. Okay, so I'm just going to type this out. It's going to be an angle bracket, exclamation, doc type, usually all capitals, and then HTML, and then closing angle bracket. So this is a doc type, and what this does is it tells the browser what type of document it is, because a browser can read HTML5, it can read XHTML, it can read HTML 4.0.1. So there's a lot of different variations of HTML, but HTML5 is definitely the standard, and that's what you're going to want to use. It's also much easier than the others, and it's less strict when it comes to tag syntax. So I just want to quickly show you from the w3schools.com site, which is a great site for reference. This is a page all on doc types. And if we go down here, you'll see that the doc type declaration must be the very first thing in your HTML document before the HTML tag, which I'll go over in a second. And down here, it gives us the different types. So for HTML5, it's what we just did. But then you'll see that HTML 4.0.1 actually has a much longer doc type because there's different variations. There's strict, transitional, frame set, and this has to do with what's allowed and what's not. So it's gotten much easier over the years with HTML5. So we don't have to worry about these doc types, but I just wanted to show you that they're very different. XHTML has its own doc type, has transitional, frame set, 1.0, 1.1, but this is the only one that we have to worry about. All right, so I just wanted to kind of show you that. So we're declaring this document as HTML5. The next thing we want is an HTML tag. Okay, so I'll do HTML and then hit enter or tab, and it'll finish it for me. And we just want to hit enter so that the bottom tag is down below. And now inside the HTML tag, we have a head tag, and then under the head, we have a body tag. Now notice that there's an indent here, and VS Code will do this automatically. If you're using something like Notepad, which I would definitely not suggest, it's not going to indent it for you automatically, so you have to do it yourself. Now the reason it's indented is because both of these tags are inside the HTML tag. Okay, this is actually the parent of these two tags, and these are the children of the HTML tag. Now the head and body are very different. Head is for things like meta tags, if you want to associate keywords with your page. It's basically just information about your page. It doesn't actually display in the browser, in the body of the browser. Now, one thing that you should definitely put in the head tag is the title. Okay, so we want to put a title tag, and again, we're tabbing it over because it's within the head tag. For the title, I'm just going to say my website. All right, now if I go ahead and save this, I'm going to do Control S. I'm going to save the file, and let's open it up. So we have our basic layout.html because we renamed it, and I'm going to say open with Chrome. And notice there's nothing in the body, but if we look in the tab, we see my website. Whatever you put in the title tag is going to show right here. Okay, so it's very important for you to have a title. Now, whatever we want in the body, we put in the body. So we can put back our H1, say my website, and we can put our paragraph. And we'll go ahead and save, and we'll go back and reload, and now we have our H1 and paragraph in the body. Okay, so anything that you want to show in this area is going to go in the body of your document. All right, so you just want to keep this structure in mind. This is the core, fundamental, mandatory structure of an HTML document. You have your doc type at the top, you have your HTML tags that wrap around everything, and then you have a head and body area. In your head, you should at least have the title, and in the body, you just have whatever your website content will be. So the last thing I want to show you is how to create a comment. Okay, so you might want to label stuff without it actually rendering in the browser. So let's say I wanted to put a comment right here. What I would do is put an angle bracket, an exclamation mark, and then a double hyphen. Once I do that in VS Code, it actually auto-completes the rest of it, but this is the format of a comment. So I'll just say this is a comment. So starts off like this, and then it ends with double hyphen and an angle bracket. So just make sure you don't forget the exclamation, because that's not a valid comment. And notice that it turns green in VS Code to let you know that it's actually a comment. And if I save this and we go to the browser and reload, notice it doesn't show here because it's a comment. Now, in browsers, you can view the source code. Okay, you can view the HTML source. On a Mac, you can do Command Option U, and on Windows, I believe it's Control U, and it'll open up a new tab that shows you the actual HTML. So you can see our doc type, our HTML tags, all that stuff. It also will show the comments in the source code. Okay, just to let you know that. So let's go back, and I want to show you how you can comment out something that's already there. So if I just put my cursor on this line right here, in VS Code I can actually just do Control and then / or question mark, the same key, the / question mark. So if I hold Control and hit that, it'll comment the whole line out, and I can toggle it. If I hit it again, Control / I can just toggle the comment. If I wanted to comment out multiple lines, I could highlight them, and again, Control / and that will comment out the whole thing. There may be times when you want to just kind of not show a certain part of the HTML in the browser, and you want to comment it out. Okay, and you can put this on a separate line as well, like that. That'll still work. This is all commented out. All right, so that's going to be it for this video, guys. In the next one, I want to give you some tips and tricks with VS Code. For instance, we can generate the basic structure automatically without having to type all this out with every HTML page. I also want to give you a couple extensions that I want to recommend and that I'll be using in this course. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. Alright guys, so in this video I want to show you how to install something called Live Server, which is something we'll be using through the course. And basically it's an extension to VS Code that will allow us to open our HTML pages on a little development server as opposed to opening them in the file system. So right now you can see that the website is open, and if you look at the URL bar, it's file : with 3 slashes, and then basically just shows the path to the file. So the server will actually open it on what's called our local host, and not only that, it will auto reload. So when we save an HTML file or CSS or JavaScript or anything else, it's going to just auto reload, so we don't have to keep hitting the reload button every time we make a change. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to just create a new file here. I'm going to call it 02_live_server.html, just naming it after what we're doing here. And there's something else that I want to show you guys. Instead of typing out the whole structure here like we did in this file, With VS Code, we can use Emmet to generate that structure. So what I'm going to do is just put an exclamation, and I can either hit Enter or Tab, and it's just going to kind of create that structure for us, so we don't have to type it out for every HTML page we create. Now notice there are some added things here. We have some meta tags. We're going to go over meta tags, including these ones, in the next video, but for now I just wanted to show you that we can quickly generate our structure, our doc type, HTML head body tags and stuff like that. So I'm just going to change the title here to live server. And we'll go down here and just put an H1, and we'll just say hello world. Doesn't really matter. I just want to put something. And then I'm going to save this with Control S. And we want to now install live server. So I'm going to go over here to this extensions icon, and let's make this a little bigger. And we're going to search for live-server. And it's going to be this one here, this first one with this purple icon. Now, to install an extension in VS Code, you just want to click the little green install button. Once it installs, you want to click reload to activate. So it's just going to kind of reset the editor, and now under enabled, you're going to see live server, and any other extensions that you install will also be displayed here. So now what we can do is, instead of leaving and going and opening up the file, we can simply right click and we can say open with live server. And the browser will automatically open, and it will display the web page. And notice the URL now is different. It's not just that file path. It's 127.0.0.1, which is what's called the loopback address. And this is always going to loop back to your local machine. So this is your local host. And then this :5500, this is the port number that it's running on. Okay, you can run things on different ports, and then you just have the name of the file that's loading. So from now on, we're going to use live server to open our files instead of, leaving and going and opening the file manually. Also, if I change something, like let's change this to, or we'll just add a paragraph here, and we'll say this is a test, and I'll just save. And now if I go to Chrome, you can see this is a test is displayed. I didn't have to go and reload it. It just auto loads. And this is great for when you actually have, your editor on one side and then the browser, because it automatically updates. Now, I don't want to do that because I only have so much screen real estate here for you guys, and I don't want to make the editor too small. We might do that in some videos later on, but for now I'm just going to switch back and forth. So to stop the server, if you go down here, you can see this port 5500. If you click that, it'll stop the server from running. And if I go back to the browser and reload, you'll see it no longer works. If I want to start it again, I can either again do open with live server, or I can click this go live link down here. If I click that, it will start it back up and open it in the browser. All right, so I just wanted to show you guys that and let you know that that's what we'll be using, as opposed to just opening our HTML files right on the file system. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at meta tags. We'll look at the ones that are generated here, as well as some others. All right, in this video, we're going to talk about and look at meta tags, which are tags or snippets that describe a page's content. And they don't appear in the body of the web page anywhere. Nobody sees them. It just describes some stuff about the page. So we're going to look at some of the popular ones, including the ones that are used in search engines. So let's create a new file. We'll call it 03_meta_tags.html. And I'm going to generate my content with Emmet. So I'm going to use exclamation tab or enter. And notice that it adds 3 meta tags. It also adds a lang attribute, which you don't need in your HTML tag, but it just describes the language as English. And these are all attributes. So tags have attributes. We're going to be using them along the way, and they describe basically their properties of the tag. So all of these are meta, right? So the only difference is the different attributes. That's how we can tell what each one is. So the first one here is char set, which is the character set, and this specifies the character encoding of the page. So UTF-8 is actually the default. It's the character encoding for Unicode. It's not extremely important to understand how this works or what it is. We could actually remove this and it would still be UTF-8. And the Unicode standard covers almost all characters, punctuation, symbols, things like that. So that's what that is. It's the character set that this page uses. The next one here is pretty important for responsive design. This is the viewport tag. And responsive design, it's all about making your website or your user interface responsive to different screen sizes. Okay, so you want your website to look good on a desktop, a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, and there's different strategies, mostly to do with CSS, on making your site look good on these devices. But one of the things you want to do is add this viewport tag, and you want to set the content value. You want to set a couple things in the content, which is one, the width. You want to set it to whatever the width of the device, and the scale should be set to 1.0. So if you've ever gone on a non-responsive site on a smartphone and you had to drag your finger over to kind of see the rest of the site, that probably doesn't have the viewport set. Okay, so you want it to actually show the entire website or the entire interface. So that's what the viewport tag does. It's actually really important. So this next one has to do with browser compatibility, this HTTP equiv. You can see the content equals IE equals Edge. So IE is referring to the old Internet Explorer browser, which is not used very much at all anymore. Windows now ships with Edge, so we're basically saying we want to use the Edge standards. And Microsoft browsers have been just a nightmare since the beginning of web development. Back when I started, it was Internet Explorer 6, which never rendered things correctly. You always had to do little hacks here and there in your CSS and in your JavaScript to get things to work. So even now, IE 11, which is the latest version, is still very clunky, but not too many people use it. I think if I look at my analytics on my website, it's like 0.3% or something ridiculous like that. So it's extremely important to support those browsers anymore, unless you're building a website that may have like a lot of elderly people as viewers, because a lot of them have older computers that they haven't updated that still run IE. All right, so now what I want to look at is meta tags that have to do with search engines. So we're going to talk a little bit about search engines, and the title is actually really important. I'm just going to put meta tags here, but in your title, you want to put something that really describes the page. You also want to put keywords that you want to rank for well on the search engines. Now, SEO, which is search engine optimization, has changed dramatically from years ago. Like there's certain things that used to be really important are not anymore. And I'm not an SEO expert, so I'm not going to speak too much on that. But the title is what shows in the search engine. So if we jump into Chrome here, and let's open up a new tab. And by the way, this time that you see here in the background, this is a Google Chrome extension called Moment. If you're interested, I know a lot of people ask me about it, so I figured I'd just tell you guys. It has to-dos and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. But let's go ahead and go to google.com, and let's search for like, let's say Miami web design. And when we look at these websites that show up, this large text here, this is the title. Okay, whatever you have in the title for the page is going to show up here most of the time. If it doesn't match the page's content, Google might take it upon itself to put something in here, but usually it's going to be your title. And then this text here, the smaller text, is actually the description meta tag, which I'll show you in a second. But if we go to this site, and which I'm not affiliated at all with, and if we could go ahead and view the source code with Command Option U or Control U on a Windows machine, and we look at the title, you'll see it's Miami Website Design Company, Digital Agency, and then the name of the company. So that's a good choice for a title. It has some keywords in there. It also has the company name, and you can see if I hover over the title, that's exactly, it should pop up here. Well, it usually does. I'm not sure why it's not popping up, but usually it'll pop up and show you the whole title. There we go. And you can see that it matches what is in the HTML. And then if we look at the meta description tag, which is, let's see, where is it? Here's the viewport. Let's search for it. So if we do a Control F and search for description, Here it is. So meta name equals description, and then the content, you'll see this is exactly what is showing up in the search engine. So Fuse is a full service Miami website design company. If we go back to the results here, Fuse is a full service Miami website design company. So this is going to be your description. This is your title. So let's go ahead and add in a description. So we're going to say meta, and we want to use the name description and content. You'd say whatever. I'm just going to put this is my website description. But you would want to put something that specifies what's on the page. You also want to put some keywords in here. I don't think the description holds too much weight, but it is what the user sees when they search for your site, so that's pretty important. And another search engine related tag is the keywords meta tag. Now, this keywords tag used to hold a lot of weight like years and years ago, but now it's not. It doesn't really matter. It's just for describing the page's content. So it's not like it's going to make or break your site in the search engine. But generally, you want to keep between like 8 and 12 words. So let's say this was a web development company. We'd put like web development, maybe web design, maybe your company name or something like that. So you generally want to have around 8 or so of these keywords. All right, so let's see. The last one that I want to show you is if you don't want your site to rank in search engines, if you don't want it to show up at all, you would use the robots meta tag. So let's say meta name equals robots, and for the content, you would want to put no index so that it doesn't index your site in the search engine, and then no follow so it doesn't follow any links on the page and index those. All right, so if for some reason you don't want your site to show up in Google and Bing and all the other engines, you would just put this in here. And I'll just put a comment. Do not index our page. All right. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm not going to go over any of the other ones right now because they're really not that important. If you want to look up some of the other ones on your own, you can do that, but I don't want to throw too much stuff at you that you don't really need right now. So that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to look at typography, look at creating headings and paragraphs and bolded text and stuff like that. All right, guys, so now we're going to look at some tags that have to do with typography. Some of the stuff we already looked at, like the H1 tag, which is a heading tag. We'll look at some of the other headings and also paragraph and the strong tag and stuff like that. So let's create a new file here called 04_typography.html. And I'm going to show you some other stuff as well, some little tips and tricks when it comes to VS Code. So let's put in our boilerplate, which is, we'll do exclamation tab, and that puts in all of our structure here. And for the title, let's change this. We'll just say like headings, paragraphs, typography. Oops. Okay, and then we're going to go down to the body here. And I'm going to put a comment. Now, if you want to just put a comment, like an empty comment, you can just do Control and then the question mark or the / key, and that will put in an empty comment. It might be Command and that key on a Mac. I'm not sure because on my Mac, I actually switch the Control and the Command keys. So when I say Control, it might be Command on a Mac. I'm not sure. So let's go ahead and just put in headings here. And another tip, if you want to go to the next line, obviously you can go to the end here and you can hit enter, but if you're in the middle here and you hit enter, it'll do that. If you want to have a clear new line and you're in the middle, you can hold down Control, or again, might be Command, and then enter, and it'll create a new line. No matter where you are here, it'll create a new line if you hold down Control. Okay, so keep that in mind. And I'm going to give you these little tips throughout the course because I think that it really helps you write your code in a more efficient way and in a much faster way. All right, so let's put some headings in here. So H1, I'm just going to say heading 1, and I'll hold Control and Enter to go to the next line. Let's do H2 tab, heading 2, oops, H3, heading 4. What else? We got heading 5. It goes up to 6. So H6, heading 6. All right, so let's save this and let's open this up with Live Server. You might have to close some of your other tabs. And this is what it's going to look like. So this is H1. It's going to be the largest, and then it goes smaller and smaller, and then H6 is going to be the smallest. Now you can change the font size through CSS. You can do whatever you want through CSS, but by default, H1 is going to be the largest. Now, a little tip or some advice that I would give is you usually only want to have an H1 per page, because the search engines actually look at this, and you want to have, like, you want to describe whatever the content is. For instance, if it's a blog post, you want to have your blog post title in the H1, okay? And you can have, you can have multiple H1s, but it's good practice to just have one per page. And then these other ones, you can have as many as you want. Say you have a roll of blog posts, maybe you have an H3 for each title. Okay, so it's not, mandatory, but I would suggest using one H1 per page if possible. So those are headings. Let's go ahead and look at paragraphs. We've already done this, but it's just a P tag. Now, I'm going to give you another tip here. With Emmet, we can generate some dummy text. If you need just some text to kind of fill, as a placeholder, you can do lorem, L-O-R-E-M, and then hit tab, and it'll give you a paragraph of dummy text or filler text. And if you want to specify a certain number of words, like let's say we want a 10-word sentence or paragraph, we could do lorem 10 tab, and it'll give us 10 words. Okay, we could even do like lorem 500, and it'll give us 500 words. I'm going to do, let's say, 100, and just generate some text. And if I save this and we go and we take a look, you'll see that we have this paragraph of 100 words. Now, inside the paragraph, I'm going to add, we'll just go anywhere, it doesn't really matter, and I'm going to put in a strong tag. Okay. Now with VS Code, once I put the beginning tag in, it adds the ending one automatically. So I'm just going to cut that out and put that over here. And then anything that's within here is within this strong tag. So let's save this and go back, and notice that it's bolded. Okay, so by default it'll be bold, but with CSS you could change the styling of this strong tag to be a different color or to be bigger font, whatever you want to do with it. But it's made to make it stand out. And at the same time, you have the emphasis tag, which is the EM. So let's say EM, and I'm going to just put the ending tag, let's say, down here. And if we save that, we take a look, by default, it's going to be italic. It's actually this right here. Okay, so you can see that the text is italic, which again, you can change within CSS, and we're going to get into CSS in the next section. So that's strong and emphasis. We also have the line break, which I showed you in one of the slides. It's one of the self-closing tags. So let's say we want a space right here without adding a new paragraph. If I just do this and save, it's not going to reflect that in the browser. Okay, this is only in the editor. I can put a million spaces here and save, and it doesn't show in the browser. To actually have a line break without adding a new paragraph, you would add in a BR tag. So I'm going to go right here and put in a BR tag. So what that's going to do is it's going to knock this onto the next line in the browser, as you can see right here. If I wanted it to go down again, I could add in another BR tag. I'm just going to put a comment here. Okay, so if we have two line breaks, you'll see that it pushes it down again, and I can push it down as much as I want. And since it's a self-closing tag, you could either do this format or you could do that. So both of these are going to work, as you can see. I tend to use this, just the HTML5. But sometimes I use a Visual Studio Code extension called Prettier, which will auto-format your code, and it adds the slash automatically. So if you've watched some of my other videos and I have the slash, that's because I'm using Prettier. And I might introduce that extension to you guys later. Now, in addition to the BR tag, we have an HR tag, which is a horizontal rule. I'm actually going to put that, let's see, we'll go right here. And let's say horizontal rule. And what this does, the HR tag, is it does a line break, but it also creates an actual line. So if we check this out, you can see it put a line across the screen. Okay, so that's a horizontal rule. Now, if you've studied HTML before, especially if it was a while ago before HTML5, you might have seen tags like the bold tag. So if we put a B here, you might have seen stuff like this. So if we actually take a look at this in Chrome, you'll see that it actually is bold, but the bold tag, along with the I tag for italics and stuff like that, the U tag for underline, it's all been deprecated because HTML is not meant for styling. And the strong tag replaced the bold tag because the strong tag is a semantic tag. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bold. It just means that it should stand out in some way, but we leave it up to the CSS to say what that way is, even though it bolds by default. And that's kind of hard to understand. It did confuse me in the beginning when HTML5 came out, but just know that we don't really use this anymore, or the U, or I think there was S for strike through. Although we do have a semantic tag for deleted text, which does by default add a strike through. So let's say we do del, and we're going to wrap this text right here. So this is actually a semantic tag. So we'll save this and take a look, and notice that it does add a strike through. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be strike through. We can change that in the CSS if we want. Maybe we want it to be highlighted with a yellow background or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean strike through like the S tag did. They took that out of HTML5 or deprecated it. All right, so in the next video, we're going to take a look at links, hyperlinks, and we're going to also look at embedding images into a web page. All right, guys, so in this video, we're going to look at links and images. And what I've done here is I've made the browser smaller so that I could fit it on the same screen as the editor, so that we can see what's going on at the same time, because we have auto reload with live server. And I won't do this for every video, just the ones where we don't need a lot of real estate in the browser window here. So let's go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this 05_links_images.html. All right, and I'm just going to close this up to give us some more room. And we're going to generate a boilerplate. And when I say boilerplate, it just means, you know, our starter template, whatever, our structure. So the title, I'm going to say links and images. And let's go ahead and let's first start with an external link. So if you want to link to another website, you can do that. So I'm going to put a paragraph in between all these links. Actually, you know what? I won't do that because I want to show you something. So a link is represented with an A tag. So I'm going to say A tab or A enter. And notice that with VS Code, it gives us this href attribute right away. And that's because every link needs an href attribute because that's the location that you're linking to. So in this case, let's link to http google.com. And inside here is what we want to put, whatever we want to click to link, like some text or an image or whatever, that's what we want to put in here. So let's just say click for Google. And we'll save this. I'm just going to add a comment here. We'll say external link. And let's go ahead and save and run with live server. Okay, so we have this link here that says click for Google. By default, it's going to be colored differently. It's going to have an underline. And if I click it, it brings us to Google. Now notice it opens in the same tab. And when you link to an external site like this, usually you want to open it in a new tab because you don't want people to drift away from your website. you're trying to show them something, but at the same time you want your website to stay open. So what we would do is add a target attribute. Now I'm going to show you another little trick here, a keyboard trick. If you want to copy this whole line down, what you can do is hold Shift Option or Shift Alt on Windows and then hit the down arrow, and that will just copy that line for you. Okay, and another tip, if you want to, you see how I'm just going back and forth here, one character at a time. If you want to go by word, you can hold down Alt, or actually on Windows it's Control, I believe, but on a Mac it's Option. And if you hit the over arrow, notice how it goes across the whole word. Okay, so it'll go from here to here, so you can go across much faster. All right, and if you want to go all the way to the beginning, you can hit the home key. If you want to go all the way to the end of the line, you can hit the end key. So it's very helpful to be able to navigate very quickly like that. So again, like I was saying, if we want to open in a different tag, we can use the target attribute. And for a value, we want to do underscore blank. Okay, so we'll save that. And what I wanted to show you is, notice how the next link here is not on a separate line. The reason for that is an A tag is actually what's called an inline element, so it doesn't knock it onto the next line like if it were a paragraph, which is actually a block element. And we're going to talk about inline and block elements, I think 2 videos from now, but I wanted you to know that there are some inline elements and there are some block elements. Now if I want this on a new line, I could put a line break, or I could just wrap them in a paragraph tag. Okay, and another tip is if I want this moved up here, I can actually just hold either Alt on Windows or Option on a Mac, and I can just bring it up. I can move this line wherever I want. All right, so we'll do that, and let's put another paragraph tag, and we'll bring that up into here. So now if I save, they're on separate lines because a paragraph is actually a block level element. And if I click the second one, it opens up in a new tab because of the target attribute. Okay, because I set it to blank. All right, so these are external links. Usually your links are going to be internal because you're going to be linking to other pages in your website, like let's say an about page or a services or contact page, something like that. So since we have these HTML files in the same folder, let's link to one of these. So we'll link to the 04 typography. So I'm going to close that back up. Let's say internal link, put a paragraph, and we'll put an A tag with an href that points to / meaning the current folder that we're in. And then with VS Code, notice that it actually shows us the HTML files that are in this folder. Okay, the / means the current folder we're in. So I'm going to choose the typography HTML, and in here let's just say typography, and we'll go ahead and save that. And then if we click typography, it brings us to that page. Okay, we don't have to put the whole like 127 001 5500. We don't have to put that in here because we're already in the same folder. So we just need that /. All right, and I'm just going to click the back button. So we can link to any inner page that way. So now let's take a look at images. So this is our folder right here, HTML Sandbox, and I'm going to just create a new folder here called images. Okay, usually you'll see this, or it might be called IMG. A lot of times you'll see that on in websites and applications. But in this images folder, I'm just going to bring over a sample image, which you should have in your HTML Sandbox in the project files, and I'm going to bring this onto our web page. Okay, so I'll go down here and let's say local image. And I'm saying local image because it's actually in our folder. It's in our file structure. You can also link to remote images that are elsewhere, and I'll show you that in a second. But let's go ahead and do an image tag, which is IMG. And in VS Code, if I do IMG enter or tab, it's going to give me 2 attributes. One is the source, which is the location of the image and the image name, and then one is basically the alternative text. So if for some reason the image doesn't show up, if it's not there or something, this will be the text that's shown. So for the alt, I'll just say my image, and then for the link here, we want to go into the images folder. Notice with VS Code, if I do a /, brings down this drop down, and I can choose the images folder, and it even shows me what's in there, the sample.jpg. So I want that. So the location and the image name itself. So if I go ahead and save, there it is. The image shows up. Now it goes out of view here because we have no CSS, so it's just going to show the full size image. But with CSS, we can actually change. Actually, we can change it with HTML as well. If I wanted to, I could add a width here. This isn't really something I'd recommend doing. Usually you would use CSS, but you can set the width and height in HTML. So if I set this to 200 and save, now you can see that it's smaller. And you can do the height as well, but the height will auto adjust if you add a width. So we can also do remote images. So same way, img, and alt, I'll just say my image 2. And for the source, I could do any source I want. Actually, there's a really good image sharing site. If you go to source.unsplash.com and we go down here, you can get random images from a specific user of the site. What I want though is, let's see, there's a fixed daily, weekly photo, so you could grab any of these URLs. Right here, random search term. So if you want a random image like of nature and water, you can just grab this URL and put in nature and water. So let's do that. So if we go back, if I save, it's going to give me an image that's 1600 pixels by 900 pixels of nature water. Let's make this smaller. We'll say 200. Okay, so there we go. And this only works because the unsplash.com allows us to do this. They basically allow us to specify the size in here. You can't do this with just any link, any image link. Same thing with keywords here. If I wanted, like, let's say building, and there we go, we get some kind of picture of a building. I think it's yeah, it's random. So if I click reload, it's just going to be a random building. And again, this has nothing to do with HTML. It's just the Unsplash service is an image sharing service, or an image placeholder service that allows us to do this. So it's pretty cool. If you're building something and you just need some kind of random image and you don't want to have it local, you can just link to Unsplash like this. All right, so I think that's going to do it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to look at lists and tables. All right, guys, in this video, we're going to take a look at lists and tables. So let's create a new file, and we're going to call it 06_lists_tables.html. And let's add in our boilerplate here, close that up, lists and tables. Okay, so we have a couple different types of lists. So we have unordered lists. And unordered lists, they're not numbered. Basically, they have bullet points, which of course you can remove with CSS. You can have different types of bullet points, but let's go ahead and create an unordered list. So we want to put a UL tag, and then each item in the list should be wrapped in a list item, an LI tag. So let's go ahead and just say item 1. And what I'll do is I'll hold down Shift and Option, or Shift and Alt, and just hit the down arrow so that we can bring these down. And let's change that to 2, 3, and 4. And we'll save this, Control S, and then let's open this with Live Server. And there we go. So that's what it's going to give us. I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit on the HTML so you can see this better. Should have probably did that a while ago. And notice that the bullets are here, and like I said, these can be removed through CSS. We can also have different types of bullets. This isn't something that I would recommend, but you can use a style tag to change CSS attributes. And there's something called a list style. And we have circle, square. Let's see, let's change it to a square. and save, and now you can see that each bullet is a square. We have disk, save that, that's the default. Circle, save that, so that's kind of an unfilled circle. And then we also have, actually I think that's it, and then we have none. All right, and this is something that I would not recommend doing. You want to put all your styling in your CSS style sheet, but I just wanted to give you an example of this. So let's get rid of that. So that's an unordered list. At the same time, we have ordered lists. And I'm going to give you another little Emmet trick here. So first of all, it's an OL tag, and then we still use LIs. Okay, we still use list items, whether it's ordered or unordered. Now with Emmet, let's say I want to have 4 list items. I can actually do times, so I could put an asterisk 4 and hit tab, and it'll actually give me 4 list items. Okay, so a little tip there. And we can fill these in. We'll say item 1, item 2, item 4, and we'll save that. And now notice that instead of bullets, we actually have numbers. Okay, so it's a numbered list. And then we can change the type as well. So there's a type attribute. So basically type 1 is the default. If I save that, you'll see no change. That's just numbers. We can use type uppercase A. If I save that, it'll change it to uppercase letters. If we use lowercase a as the type, it'll be lowercase letters. We can use uppercase I, which will actually do uppercase Roman numerals. Lowercase I will do lowercase Roman numerals. So just to let you know that you can add the type attribute. Ordered list is something that I almost never use. Unordered list is something you're going to use all the time because they're used for navigation menus, whether it's a horizontal nav bar or if it's a side menu or anything like that. So we can also have nested lists. So let's actually copy this. So I'm going to just Control C, copy this UL here, and Control V will paste that in. And let's say we want to have a list within a list. So inside this LI, this second one, let's get rid of that. Actually, we'll keep that, but next to it, I'm going to go on a new line, and I'm going to put another UL inside here, and let's put a LI, and we'll say nested item 1, okay, and then we'll do nested item 2, and let's save that. And now you can see that these 2 items are nested, and it automatically changes the bullet point here to a circle, changes it from a disk to a circle. So lists are pretty simple. Styling them is a whole new level when you start to get into creating navigation bars and stuff like that, but we'll get into that later on when we start to deal with CSS. All right, so let's talk about tables. Okay, so tables are used for tabular data. Now, back in the day, back in, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years ago, people would actually use tables for website layout. Before we had proper CSS, before we had Flexbox and the grid system and frameworks and stuff like that, people would actually have like their sidebar and their main content area in their website be a table, which is absolutely horrible. You never want to do anything like that. You only want to use tables for tabular data. Okay, if you have a list of users or whatever it may be, just some kind of data. So to create a table, we want to put a table tag, and in a table we have a head, a body, and we can also have a footer if we want. I don't usually use footers, but for the head, we're going to say thead, okay, and we want a table row, and inside the table row, we want some columns, but when it's a heading, you want to use th, okay, for table head, and let's do first name, and then we'll bring this down twice by holding Control Option or Control Alt and hit the down arrow twice. And we'll change this to, let's say, last name, and let's do email. Okay, now if I save this, you'll see that these are our headings. Okay, so these are the headings, and then we want the data underneath. So the data is going to go in the T body. Okay, so we have our table head, and then our table body, which will also have table rows, but instead of TH, we want to use TD. Okay, TH is only for the heading. And then we'll say, let's do John, bring down 2 more. So Doe would be the last name, and email. Okay, if I save that, and there we go. So we have first name, we have one entry here, or one row with it, which is John Doe, and then his email. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole table row, and let's do 2 more. Probably want to fix this up a little bit. And we'll go ahead and change up some of this data. So we'll say Kate Smith, Kate, Jeff, all right, so we'll save that, and now we have 3 rows in our table. Okay, so pretty simple. If we want to, we could change the width. Now, I would suggest doing this stuff through CSS, but just to show you we can use the style attribute, and we can say width, I don't know, 600 pixels, and now it's wider. And it's more readable like that. But again, I would suggest not using the style attribute. That's not good practice. But we haven't gotten into CSS yet. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at forms and input fields. Alright guys, so now we're going to take a look at forms and inputs. Now, it's important to understand that with forms on a website, displaying them is with HTML, and then we can style them with CSS, but when you submit a form and make it do something, like let's say a registration form, that stuff happens on the back end, and that happens with some type of programming language like PHP or Python or JavaScript or something like that. So just understand that HTML and CSS are to display the form, but server-side programming languages, which you'll learn in another course, that's what is used to actually process the form. Okay, even a simple contact form, although there are some services that you can use that will basically, you can kind of insert a snippet into your HTML, and you can use their service to process your form. And we may talk about that much later on. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at creating a form and the different inputs. So I'm going to create a file called 07_forms_input.html. And let's go ahead and put our boilerplate in here. We'll change the title to forms and input. And let's go down to the body area and create a form. Okay, so we're going to use a form tag. And notice when I use Emmet to create a form tag, it gives us an action. This is where the form is going to be submitted to. Okay, so you would submit it to a file. Sometimes it's going to be a PHP file if that's what you're working with on your server. It might be something like a file called process.php, where it would take all the form inputs, the values, maybe integrate it with a database so you can insert the data into a database, something like that. So in here is where we're going to put our inputs, and I'm going to separate our labels and inputs with divs. Okay, so divs are just basically just that, divisions, if you want to separate your markup in in certain ways. So I'm going to put a label in here. So if I say label tab, it'll give me a for attribute, and this for attribute, you want this to match the ID of the input, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's say this is going to be for the user's name. We'll put the text name in here. Right under it, we're going to put an input. And in VS Code and Emmet, if I hit enter or tab, it's going to give me a type of text by default, which is what we want right now. So if I go ahead and save this, and let's actually run this in live server, you'll see we have a label and we have our input. Now, if I give this an ID of name, which is the same value I did for the for attribute, if I save that and I click on the label, it'll actually highlight the form. Okay, so if you want that functionality, then you want to put the for in the ID. If this doesn't match, you'll see if I click on the label, it doesn't actually highlight the form. It's not something you need to do, but if you want that functionality, then you want to add both of these. And then a lot of times with inputs, you'll have a name attribute, which in this case, the value just happens to be name. But this is what is used on the server side. So if on the server in, like, let's say PHP, you want to grab the value, you would use whatever this is, in this case, name. All right, so let's move on to create another input here. So we'll put another div. We'll do a label this time. Let's make this an email. So we'll put an input in here. Now with Emmet, we can do a colon here and then whatever the type of input. So I want this to be an email type. And if we do that, it'll also give us the name ID by default. So we're going to fill this in with email and email. All right, and I'll save that. And notice it looks just like the text field, but it has to actually be an email for it to submit. Okay, so you can actually easily add validation by just using this type email. Okay, it's just client-side validation. If you're working with a server with, like, let's say PHP, you'd want to add validation there as well. So that's an email field, and if you want to put your label on a separate line without CSS, you could put a line break here. Let's go ahead and do that. Just think it just looks a little better like that. And I'm going to show you how to style a form really nice later on. It's actually going to be one of our challenges. So let's go ahead and create another field here. Let's do a div and a label, and this is going to be for message. And message is going to be a text area, which is different from a text input like this, because it's bigger. It's for more content, usually like a message or, I don't know, a bio or something like that. And a text area has its own tag, which also has an ending tag. And I'm going to get rid of these for a second here and just have the name and ID. So for name, let's say message. ID, we'll say message. And then we don't have to put anything within the text area tags, but if I save that, let's put a line break after the label and save it. And you'll see that it's a little bigger. Now, if we want to make this even bigger without using CSS, we can use the calls and rows attribute. So for calls, let's do 50 and save. So what this is it's 50 columns going this way. All right. If we want to make it bigger vertically, then we can use rows. So we'll say rows equals 5 and save, and now it's 5 rows going down. And you can make it as big or as small as you want. So that's a text area. So these are the main ones. Like this could be a contact form right here, but there are other ones. Let's look at a select list. So again, we'll put a div in here. Okay. And in here, let's put a select tag with a name and ID. Let's call this gender. Actually, we'll call it sex. We'll be politically correct here. So we'll say sex, and actually we want to go inside the select. We don't want to do this. I meant to put a label here. So let's do label. And then inside the select is where we want to put our options. If I just save it like this, I forgot to put the text in here, we have just an empty select list. So for each option, we want to put an actual option tag with a value. So in this case, we'll say male, and then we'll put the text in here. And let's just copy this down. We'll say female. And then we'll just put other as an option as well. Okay, so now we have a select list with kind of this drop-down menu where we can select an option. Okay, so that is select. Let's take a look at number. So we'll have a label, and let's make this one an age. You might use this for age. Put a line break here. And let's say input, and then colon number, because we want it to be the type of number. And if you don't want to remember these Emmet shortcuts right now, if it's too much, you don't have to. It will make your life easier in the future. So for name, let's say age, and for ID, age. Okay, if we save that, it's going to look like a text field, but when we click inside of it, or when we hover over it, actually, we get these arrows, and we can go ahead and we can kind of just increment and decrease the number. We can also type in a number, and we can't type in any letters except for E, because that can actually be part of a number. So that's a number field. It's good for ages, stuff like that. Let's take a look at the date type. So we'll say div, we'll do a label, and let's make this one birth date. And we'll put a line break at the end here. Okay, we want to do input type of date, and we'll say birth date for the name and birth date for the ID. Save that, and it's going to give us this. Now there's two ways we can use this. We can click inside of it. We can put in like like that, or we can click this little arrow, which will give us this date picker, and we can actually pick a date. We can go ahead and scroll through the months and years, and makes it a lot easier to format dates, and it makes the user format it in a certain way. So next, let's look at radio buttons. Create another div here, and let's do label. For this, let's call it membership. Maybe this is some kind of sign up form for a membership, and there's different levels. So we're going to do an input for each one with the type of radio. We'll call the name is going to be the same for each one, which will be membership, but the value is going to be different for each one. So value, let's say there's a membership called simple. All right, so we'll do, oh, what happened here? Value is going to be simple, and then the ID, we'll say membership. So if we want to have more than one radio button, we'll just copy this down. Let's do 3 times. Let's say the second membership value is going to be standard, and then this third one is going to be, let's say, super. Maybe it's like a hosting package or something like that. So if we save, you'll see that we just have the buttons. There's no label, and if we want a label, we just put the text right next to it. So we'll say simple. Okay, we don't even have to do like a label tag or anything. Standard and super, and save, and there we go. So now we can choose one of these. Okay, now let's say that when you load the page, you want one pre-selected. If you want to do that, what you can do is you can take the one you want selected, like let's say standard, and we can add an attribute here of checked. So if I say checked and then it loads the page, you'll see that it's automatically going to be checked. And I forgot to mention with select, we can do the same thing. Let's say we want female selected. On a select list, you don't use checked, you use selected. So if I save that, now notice that female is selected by default. Also, if we want to pre-fill a value here, like let's say in name, we want a value, we can actually add a value attribute. And let's say John Doe, and save. Now sometimes you may want something in here that's not an actual value, but kind of like a message, like enter an email or something like that. Before HTML5, we would have to actually use a value, but you would want that to go away when you click in the box, so we would have to use JavaScript to add that functionality. But with HTML5 came placeholder. Okay, so if we want to add placeholder and set that to, let's say, enter an email, and we save, now it seems like it's filled like the value, but notice the text is lighter, and if I click inside of it, it doesn't like it doesn't go away, but it gives me the cursor at the beginning. It's not something that I actually have to delete, which we don't want. Okay, so that's a placeholder attribute. So the last type I want to show you is a checkbox, which is very similar to a radio button, except you can choose multiple options. Notice with the radio, I can only choose one. Okay, so there's different situations where you might want to use a checkbox, and certain situations where you might want to use a radio. So I'm going to copy the whole div with the membership, and let's change this to, let's just say I like This will be like a hobbies, I guess, or I mean, it doesn't matter. It's just an example. But we want to change all the types here to checkbox. Now I'm going to show you another little trick. If you highlight something, like let's say radio, and you want to choose the next thing that matches the next text of radio, you can hold Control D and it'll choose the next one. If you want to choose the next, do it again, and notice all three are now selected, and I can change them all at the same time. I'm going to change them all to checked. I'm sorry, not checked, checkbox, like that. And then if you hit escape, it'll bring you back to your single cursor, or you can just click somewhere else. And then for the name, I'm going to double click and highlight, and I want to select all the memberships here. So I'm going to do Control D again, just to select all of these, and I'm going to change it to likes, like that. Okay, and then we can escape, and there we go. So we have a checkbox, likes. For the values, I'm going to change this one to, let's say bike. Let's say this is like a vehicle. So bike might not be the best example, but it's fine. I want to change that to bike. This will do car. And we want to change the value here to car. Should probably do the values lowercase. The value is the actual data that gets sent to the server. Say boat, and we'll change that to boat. Okay, so let's save that. Now we have a checkbox that says I like. Car is selected by default because we have checked. I'm going to get rid of that. And we can go ahead and we can check as many as we want. Like that. Okay, so that is a checkbox. Now we're going to add a submit button, because obviously a form is no good unless you can actually submit it. Now with a submit, you can do a couple things. You can either oh, and that's something I want to show you too. If we have all of these tabbed over and we want to bring them back, we can hold shift and then hit tab and it'll bring it backwards. So for a submit button, we could use an input like this. We could say input and give it a type of submit, and then give it a value, which would be the text that's actually displayed in the button. So if I save that, now we have a button that says submit. Another way to do it would be to use button tag. So we could do button and again give it a type of submit, and now we would just put the text in the middle like that, because input is a self-closing tag, button is not. So you would put the text in the middle. So that will give us the same thing. All right, I'm just going to comment these just so you guys know what is what. So that's a text input. This is an email input. This is a message input. Not a message, a text area input. Let's see, this is a select. This is a number. This is a date. Radio. And checkbox. And then this is an input submit. Okay, so if you ever need to come back here for reference, you can do that. Let's actually just make this button submit. Okay, now one more thing I want to show you is we can add a reset button. I'm going to actually comment out one of these because we don't want two submit buttons. But if we want to do a reset, we can do button with the type of reset, like that. We'll put the text reset in here. And now if I fill some stuff in, let's say 33, and then I hit reset, it'll clear everything out, except for John Doe, because we hard-coded that value in here, like that. All right, so that's how we can create forms, and I know that this form is extremely ugly. I'm going to show you how to style forms when we get to the CSS section. This is just how we can actually display the fields. All right, guys, so that's it. I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at inline level elements and block level elements. Now, certain tags or HTML elements are blocks, some are inline. Now, this is a page from W3 Schools, which is a great reference site, and it shows us which elements are block and which are inline. So all of these tags right here are block level. So we have paragraph, form, all the H tags, the heading tags, these header section, all this stuff. These are our HTML5 semantic tags, nav, main. I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. Those are very important. But for now, let's look at the ones that we know, like paragraph, ordered list, unordered list, list item. All of these are block level. And then for inline, we have A tags, which are links. We have, let's see, button. We have span. Oh, we didn't talk about spans yet. Select. What else here have we looked at? And these bold and italics, we're not going to be using those anymore. Emphasis, strong, text area. These are inline. Now, the difference here is that a block level element will span 100% width of the page. Okay, so it basically goes across the whole page, and then the next thing that you put on the page is going to be on the next line because it knocks it down to the next line. An inline element does not span across the page. It only takes up that space. Therefore, the next thing you put is going to go to the right of it. It's just going to go right after it. So let me give you some examples. Okay, so let's create a file here. I'll call it 08 underscore block underscore inline.html, and we'll go ahead and put our structure in here. Let's say inline verse block, and inside the body here, let's go ahead and put a paragraph, which is a block level element, and I'll say lorem. Let's do lorem 30 tab or enter. And we'll save that. Let's go ahead and open this with live server. Okay, so this is a block level element. If I put another paragraph underneath it, right? Let's say lorem 20 tab. Notice how it gets pushed on to the next line. Paragraphs actually have styling by default. See the space here? They actually have default margin, which we'll talk about when we get to the CSS. But since it's block level, it goes across the whole page and pushes the next one onto the next line. Now, a link, an A tag, is an inline element. So let's go ahead and let's put a link, not within a paragraph, but just a link itself. And if we put a number sign, that just means it goes to the current page you're on. It doesn't go anywhere. And in here, let's just say a link. And if I save it, this is an inline element, which means if we add another link, let's copy this down, and I save, notice that it goes next to it. It doesn't get pushed on to the next line because it doesn't span all the way across. Okay, so that's the difference here. Now I'm going to add a style attribute because I want to put a border around all of these just so you can see kind of the outline of them. And again, I don't suggest using style tags. You want to use CSS, but we haven't gotten to that yet. I'm just showing you this for an example, and you'll learn all about borders and stuff later on. But I'm just going to say border green solid, and we'll do the same with the next one. So I'll just copy this, and let's save that, and you can see that it goes all the way across. Now let's add a red border to the link. So I'm just going to change this to red and save, and you can see that it doesn't go all the way across. Now you might be saying, well, these paragraphs are, they're long, they reach all the way across the page, but this doesn't, the end doesn't. If it were inline, the next one would start right here. So even if I just had a one-word paragraph and I save, it goes all the way across. Okay, so that's the difference, and it's very important to understand that. So another block level element is an unordered list as well as list items. So when I put a list item in here and another one, it knocks it down to the next line because it's a block level element. And you can change you can change it from inline to block or vice versa using CSS, and we're going to get into that later, but I just want you to understand the difference between inline and block. And then those let not span, I want to do a strong. The typography semantic tags like strong and strong and emphasis, those are also obviously inline, because you can see we can make this strong, but it doesn't knock it down to the next line. So these are inline. And you also have something called inline block, which I'll talk about when we get to CSS, because it doesn't really pertain to just HTML. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, guys. I just wanted to clear that up before we move on. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about divs with IDs and classes. Alright guys, in this video we're going to talk about divs and spans, which are both HTML elements or tags, as well as ID and class attributes, which are used for semantics. They're used to kind of separate content. They're also used for CSS styling, which we're going to talk about in the next section. So let's create a new file called 09 underscore, and we'll just call it ID underscore class.html. And we're going to put our structure, our boilerplate in here. And for our title, we'll say div span ID and class. So we've used divs before. We used it to separate our our labels and inputs in the form, and where we talked about forms. So let's put a div in here, and let's say that this is going to be the header of our website. We have maybe an H1, say my website, or maybe you have an image, a logo image, and then we'll put a paragraph that says like some kind of slogan. We'll just say a site about me. Now, since everything in this div pertains to the header, I'm going to give this an ID of header, okay, or maybe even main header, because you could have multiple headers. Maybe you have you have articles on the page and you have headers for the articles. So let's call this the main header. All right, and then underneath that, let's create a UL, and let's give it some LIs, some list items, and we'll put some links inside here. And let's say this is the home page link. I'm going to copy this down twice. We'll say this is the about link. Goes to the about page. This goes to, let's say, contact. So this is a navigation menu. So let's give this UL an ID of, let's call it main nav. You can call it whatever you want. Now let's say underneath the navigation we have an area that has some information about us or about our page or whatever it may be. So we'll have a div, and let's give it an ID of about. Now here I'm going to show you a very, very helpful Emmet trick. Okay, so again, Emmet is installed with VS Code, and it allows us to do things faster. So instead of typing out ID equals, what we can do is we can say div, and we can put just a number sign which represents an ID, the word about, and then tab or enter, and it puts it in for us. And then to take it a step further, if it's a div, like we could do this with an H1, we could give it an ID of about like that. But if it's a div, we don't even have to write the word div. We can simply just put a number sign and then about, and then hit tab or enter, and it will give us a div with the ID of about. Okay, so nice little tip there. And again, you don't have to use it, but it will make you write your HTML much faster. So let's say in this about we have an H3, which is a heading. We'll say about, and then maybe a paragraph with some text. We'll just generate some dummy text here. Okay, and then maybe under that div we have, let's say, an area for contact info. Okay, and I know I haven't talked about spans or classes yet. I'll get to that in a minute. So let's create a div with the ID of contact. And in here, maybe we have another heading. Remember, it's good practice to not have more than one H1. I don't think, well, yeah, we do have an H1, which is in the header. So every div here is using an H3 as a title. You could use an H2, and again, you could use an H1. It's just good practice to just have one on the page. So let's put a UL here. We'll do some list items. We'll put like address, 50 Main Street, Boston, Mass. Let's put another list item with a phone. And let's do another list item with an email. We'll just say me at, I don't know, somethingcool.com. Okay, and then finally maybe we have a footer, so we'll have a div here with, actually we can just do ID footer. And we'll have a paragraph, and let's just say copyright 20, we'll do 2019 because it's the very end of 2018 right now. All right, so let's save this and take a look. We'll open it with Live Server. It's going to look very ugly because we have no CSS, but it's structured in a very common way. So we have a header, we have the navigation, we have some different sections about contact, and then we have a footer at the bottom. And we used IDs for all of these. Now, when it comes to CSS, we can grab onto these IDs and we can style these sections by their ID, but we also have something called classes. Now, a lot of people get confused on when do I use an ID and when do I use a class, and the reason for that is there's no functional difference. Like, they don't behave any differently. You can style them the same exact way, but it's good practice to always have your IDs be individual, meaning you're not going to have a main header ID anywhere else. Like, you're not going to go down here and have a main header ID. You're not going to have another section on the page that has an ID of about. So basically just one per ID. Now, a class you can repeat. So let's say we wanted to style like a border and a light gray background around the about and the contact area. We might have a class called card. Actually, I'm going to add a CSS style up here, and don't worry if you don't know what any of this is. I'm going to do this later. I'm going to show you this later, but I'm just going to put a style that grabs onto the card class, and we're going to add a class of card to both of the divs of about and contact. So, oops, did that backwards. We want to do class equals card, and then let's go down to the contact div right here, and also give that a class of card, and let's save. And now notice they both have the same styling, so you can see the difference here. IDs, they're individual to that section, but classes you can repeat. So we can have as many cards as we want. If I wanted the header to have that same style, excuse me, I could give that a class of card as well, and it would get that styling. Okay, so that's the biggest difference between IDs and classes. Now, some people, I mean, everyone's different. Some people don't even use IDs. They'll just use classes. Like, instead of doing this, you might see something like this, like class, main, header, and card, both in you know, both classes. But I think that this is a better way to structure it. Okay, but you'll come to find your own way of doing things. But generally, the most important thing is not to repeat IDs on the same page, at least. All right, so next let's talk about divs and spans. We've used quite a bit of divs here to separate out our content, and the main difference between a div and a span is a div is a block level element. It pushes the next thing down. So let's say I had a style for, let's do a class called enhance, and let's say we want the color to be yellow, and we want the background color to be black. And this is CSS. I'm gonna go over this all in the next section. And let's say we wanted to add it to a piece of text in this paragraph. So if we use a div, if we say div class equals enhance, and let's wrap this div, let's put it like right here, and let's save it, we get that styling, but it knocks it onto the next line. It basically goes in between, you know, this line and this line. This is a case where we want to use a span because a span is an inline element. So let's grab this. I'll highlight this div and do Control D to grab the next one and just change them both to a span. Okay, save it, and now notice that it's not block level. It just stays in its place, and we can still add that styling. So that's the difference between a span and a div. For the most part, you're going to be using divs, but when you need it to be inline, you want to use a span. Now, HTML5, when it was released, it came out with something called semantic tags to better to better lay out our sections. So for instance, there's a header tag which we could use instead of having to use an ID, we could use the actual header tag. There's something called a nav tag we could use for navigation. There's section tags for stuff like this. And we're going to go over that soon. But in the next video, I want to just quickly cover entities, okay, which are little symbols we can use in HTML. For instance, this copyright down here, if we want to put a copyright symbol, we can do ampersand copy semicolon. And if I go ahead and save that, and now you'll see down here it actually gives us a little copyright symbol. So I want to talk a little bit about that in the next section before we move on to HTML5 semantic tags. Alright, in this video we're going to look at entities and symbols real quick. Okay, so we're going to create a new file called 10 underscore, and let's just call this entities.html. Okay, so we're going to put in our boilerplate. Let's say entities. So the first thing I want to show you is a non-breaking space. I'm going to put a comment here and say non-breaking space. So if I put a paragraph and I say, hello, my name is Brad, and I run this in live server, or you open your web page, so we just have a paragraph that says, hello, my name is Brad. Let's say that I wanted to put a bunch of white space. Okay, so where you see no text, it's called white space. Let's say I wanted to put a bunch of it in between is and Brad. Like if I go over here and I just put a bunch of spaces like that and I save, there's no difference. Okay, it doesn't, the browser is not going to see these spaces and render it like that. If you wanted to do that for some reason, and there's not too many cases where you would do this, but if you did, you could use a non-breaking space, which is an HTML entity. So it's actually going to be ampersand NBSP semicolon. Okay, remember in the last video at the end I showed you the copyright entity, which was ampersand copy semicolon. And you can look these up on W3 Schools. You can find a list of all the entities, symbols, and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and save this, and you see how it knocked it over a little bit? If I go ahead and grab this again and put another one, let's put a couple of them, and save, it'll keep pushing it over. So if you ever need to push a line over like that, you can use a non-breaking space. So next thing I'm going to show you is how we can use, or how we should use angle brackets. So greater than and less than. Obviously they're used in HTML tags, but what if we wanted to actually put them in the HTML page? Let's say greater than and less than. So I'll put a paragraph and let's just say 5. Maybe this was a page that had some math equations or something. We'll say 5 is greater than 2. If we save that, it does actually show up on the page, but in some browsers it can actually get confused because it looks like the beginning or actually the end of an HTML tag. So usually when you do this, if you want to actually put an angle bracket displayed on the page, you would use the entity ampersand GT semicolon. Okay, GT is greater than. So let's save this and you'll see that it renders the same thing. Okay, if we wanted to do a less than, let's actually we'll just copy this down, and let's say, let's do 1 is less than 2. We could use LT. If I save that, you'll see 1 is less than 2. There's also numbers for entities as well. So I'm just actually going to copy this down again, the greater than, and instead of doing GT, I'm going to do number 62 and save, and notice that it again gives me the greater than. So the number for less than is actually 60. So we would do ampersand number sign 60 and save, and you'll see it gives us the same thing. Now in most cases you're going to use the greater than and less than, but I just wanted to show you that you can actually use the number. Okay, we already saw the copyright, but I'm going to put it in here anyways. So we're going to do ampersand copy semicolon. This is the one that I use frequently. We also have the trademark So let's do ampersand, and this is REG. And if we save that, you can see it gives it, oh, not the trademark, the little R. If we want to do like currency stuff, dollar signs, pounds, stuff like that, we can do, let's see, for, well, obviously dollar signs, we can use the actual key, but let's say we want to do cents. We could do ampersand cent, save, and it gives us the little cent sign. Okay, we can also do, if we're working with foreign currencies like pound, oops, we can do pound, we can do yen, we can do euro. If we save that, we get all those different symbols. We can even do suits, like card suits. Okay, such as spades. So if I wanted to do ampersand spades, semicolon, there we go. And of course we have the other three. So if we want clubs, hearts, and diamonds is actually DIAMS. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you're probably not going to use these very much, but I did just want to show you guys it. Also, if you want to display something in like computer code font, you can use the code tag. So let's say computer code. So let's say code, which is a tag. And let's say we wanted to display PHP. Okay, it's PHP code. Now in PHP, you start your code with this right here. This is an opening PHP tag, and this is a closing PHP tag, and you could put like echo, a string, hello, and I don't expect you to understand any of this, but let's say we wanted to display this on the page, and we wanted it to look like code. So we would replace this with the entity of less than, so we'll do ampersand LT semicolon, and then let's replace this with ampersand GT semicolon. And we'll save that, and now down here, notice that it actually looks like code. Okay, so if you wanted to put a code snippet into your page, maybe it's a programming site or something like that, that's how you would do it. There's also a tag called KBD for keyboard. So if we wanted to put like a paragraph and we were giving instructions to say save the file by pressing, and let's say we were telling them how to save a file, so Control S. We could put a KBD tag, and we could put in CTRL plus S. We'll do that, yeah, like that, and save. And now save the file by pressing Control S. And notice the Control S is kind of it's in that computer code font. Okay, so it's, again, not these aren't things that you're going to use all the time, but it's something that is good to know. And again, if you want to look at all of the different entities and symbols available in HTML, you can go to the W3 Schools. It's like I said, it's a great reference site. All right, so in the next video, we're going to start to look at HTML5 semantic tags. All right, guys, so before HTML5, we would put everything in divs, much like you saw in, not the last video, but the one before that, where we had an ID of main header, we had an ID of main nav. With HTML5, we got semantic tags, like header, footer, nav, so we can actually describe what is in that tag. Now, this isn't just for organization, although it is excellent for organization. It's also for accessibility. It helps people with disabilities that have hearing disabilities, vision disabilities. It helps them understand what goes where. So they're very important to use instead of just using divs, which have no meaning at all. So these are the more popular HTML5 tags. There are a couple other ones, but these are the main ones. And then I just have a sample that I found on the internet that kind of shows you what goes where. It's not using all of these, but I'm going to explain each one. So basically we have header and footer. That's pretty self-explanatory. As you can see here, headers usually go at the top, footers usually go at the bottom. A lot of times your header will have like a logo. You may have your navigation in your header. You may have it underneath. You may have like a search box or something like that. Next we have nav, which is used for navigation. I don't have an example on this, but let's say you have a nav bar here, which would be a UL, an unordered list, and then you'd wrap it in the nav tag. Okay, or maybe you have a side menu, which is a UL that you wrap in a nav tag. Main, which also isn't on here, could be wrapped around this whole area, which is like the main content of the page, or maybe even around this whole thing. There's no like special science to this. Some of it is preference, but there are just some general rules to follow. It just generally means the main content of your page, and a lot of times people don't even use main. They'll just split it into sections. Yeah, you can use main. Section is going to be just that. For instance, the about div that we had, and then the contact div, that's where I would use a section. Instead of using a div there, I'd say section and maybe still give it an ID of about or whatever. And then article is going to be used for just that. If there's an article post or a blog post, a lot of times you'll see multiple blog posts and then maybe a read more button or something. Those could be wrapped in article tags, okay, instead of divs. And then aside is just that. It's sidebar content, or just content that it's not the main focus of the page. It could be maybe an ad, or it could be like a category section for the main blog section, something like that. Okay, so these are the HTML5 semantic tags. Now I'm going to give you a little challenge, and I want to give you a layout that only uses divs, and I want you to figure out where to put these semantic tags, okay, all the ones that I just showed you. So let's go ahead and create a new file here. We'll call this 11 underscore HTML5 underscore semantics.html, and you're going to have this HTML file in your project files for this video, and I'm going to paste it in. And it does have a bunch of CSS up at the top in the style. Don't worry about this. I just wanted it to look like an actual web page. We're going to learn how to do all this later on. But just pay attention to the HTML. So I'm going to save this and open it up just to see what it looks like. Okay, so it's not very good looking, but it is laid out like an actual website. So we have a header, we have our main area, we have this section here, this section here. We also have some articles in the section, and then we have our sidebar with a navigation. So keep that stuff in mind. Keep those elements in mind, and let's look at the HTML. So we have a div with the ID of header, right? Down here we have a div with the ID of main. We have a div with the ID of welcome, and the comments should give you hints as well. Welcome section. We have the blog section. We have article 1. Article 2, but notice that they're all using divs. So I just want you to figure out where the HTML5 tags go. We have a sidebar. Inside the sidebar, we have our navigation, and then we have our footer. Okay, don't worry about this clear. This just has to do with the floats. We just floated using CSS, so we had to clear it. Don't worry about that. So just take a look at this and take a look at this and figure out what goes where. Okay, and I'll even do the first one for you. So for header, we have this div. So what I would do is replace this with header, and then the ending tag also with header. And we can keep the ID. Okay, if we were going to style it or something, we could even style it just by the element itself, but you may want to keep the ID. But that's the first one I'm going to do. So take a look at the rest. And I want you to replace certain divs where you think they should be replaced with these HTML5 semantic tags. Okay, and then in the next video, I'll give you my solution. All right, guys, so in the last video, I gave you a little challenge. I wanted you to replace the certain divs with HTML5 semantic tags to just make it more accessible, more organized. And I did the first one for you, which is the div with the ID of header. So we use the header tag here. So the next one is pretty obvious. We have a div with the ID of main that goes around, let's take a look at the project, goes around all of this area, which is basically the main content of the page. So that would be replaced with the main tag. So this ends, like I said, you can click on a div and it ends here. So we want to change the ending div and we want to change the starting div. Okay, so that's the first one. Next one is going to be in here. We have the welcome section, which ends right here. So this is actually going to be a section. Okay, so we're going to change that, and we're going to change that to section. Next, we have the blog section. Now this ends right here, so we're going to change this to section and change that to section. Now within the blog, we have some articles, so div with the class of article. So these are going to be changed to article. I'm going to select the div right here and then do a Control D. I'm also going to get the next one and the next one. Okay, so just some shortcuts here. We're going to change all of these to article. Okay, so the next thing is the sidebar. Now remember, a side is for content that's not the main content, but it's on the page. We have navigation, we have contact stuff here. So we're going to grab this div right here along with the ending div and put in a side. Now the UL, the way that nav works is we don't actually replace the UL, we wrap the UL in a nav tag. So let's say, oops, let's do nav, and then we'll grab this, and I'll just hold Option or Alt and then the up key and just move it up into the nav. Okay, and then the last thing is going to be the footer, which I want to replace the div here with footer. And let's save, and if we take a look at the result, it looks the exact same. Alright, so if any of what we've talked about has been confusing, don't worry about it. We're going to be doing this stuff all along throughout the course, so you're going to get the hang of it. If what we've talked about has been painfully easy for you, don't worry about it. Things are going to get more complicated. I just want to start from absolute scratch for people that have never even written a paragraph tag before. So hopefully both sides are somewhat satisfied. Hopefully that you're starting to get it if you're an absolute beginner, and hopefully I didn't bore you to death if you're a more advanced front-end developer. All right, so in the next video, or I'm sorry, in the next section, we're going to jump into CSS basics. So we're going to start to talk about all the basic properties for colors and padding and margin and the box model. We're going to look at things like positioning, different types of positioning, relative, absolute, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's it. I'll see you in the next section.